The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Portland as Michael Thompson shuffled along the sidewalk, his worn boots scraping against the concrete. His weathered hands gripped a cardboard sign that read, "Homeless Veteran, Anything Helps." Though the words had begun to fade from countless days in the rain, most people walked past without a glance, their eyes fixed on their phones or the path ahead, treating him as part of the urban landscape rather than a human being. Michael had been living on these streets for 3 years now, ever since the eviction notice came, and he couldn't scrape together enough money for a new place. The transition from housed to homeless had happened faster than he ever imagined possible. One day he was struggling to pay rent on his small apartment, working odd jobs when his back allowed it, and the next he was sleeping in doorways and under bridges. At 52 years old, Michael carried himself with a military bearing that 28 years of service had permanently etched into his posture. Even in his current circumstances, he maintained a certain dignity that set him apart from others in similar situations. His graying hair was kept short and neat when he could manage it, and despite the threadbare condition of his clothes, he tried to keep them as clean as possible using public restrooms and the occasional shelter facility. The tattoo on his right forearm told a story that most passers-by never bothered to read. Partially hidden beneath the sleeve of his faded jacket, the intricate design featured an eagle perched atop a globe and anchor, the unmistakable emblem of the United States Marine Corps. Below it, in bold letters, were the words Semper Fi and the dates of his service, 1989-2017. But to the rushing crowds of downtown Portland, it was just another marking on just another homeless person. Michael's journey to the streets had been a gradual descent that began long before he lost his housing. After retiring from the Marines with the rank of staff sergeant, he had struggled to find his place in civilian life. The skills that had made him an exceptional leader in combat situations didn't easily translate to the corporate world. Job interviews felt like foreign terrain, and the constant noise and chaos of civilian life left him feeling overwhelmed and disconnected. The invisible wounds of war had taken their toll as well. 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan had left him with memories that haunted his sleep and anxiety that made crowded spaces feel threatening. The Department of Veterans Affairs had been helpful to some extent, providing counseling and medical care, but the bureaucracy was slow and often frustrating to navigate. Appointments were scheduled weeks in advance, and the medications prescribed to help with his PTSD made him feel like a different person, not necessarily a better one. His first job after retirement was at a warehouse, loading and unloading trucks. The physical nature of the work suited him, and for a while, it felt like he might be able to build a stable life. But a back injury sustained during his final deployment gradually worsened, and the repetitive lifting required by the job became increasingly painful. Workers' compensation claims moved at a snail's pace, and medical bills began to pile up faster than his modest paychecks could cover them. The apartment he rented was in a rough neighborhood, but it was what he could afford on his disability payments and part-time wages. When the warehouse job became impossible due to his worsening back condition, he tried to make ends meet with various temporary positions: security guard, handyman, delivery driver. Each job lasted only as long as his physical limitations allowed, which was never very long. His social circle had shrunk considerably since leaving the military. The camaraderie and brotherhood he had known in the Corps was difficult to replicate in civilian life. His military friends were scattered across the country pursuing their own post-service careers and families. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his new reality. In the Marines, he had been part of something larger than himself, surrounded by people who understood him without explanation. As a civilian, he felt adrift and alone. The final blow came when his landlord decided to renovate the building and terminate all existing leases. With his credit damaged by medical debt and his income unstable, Michael couldn't qualify for another apartment. The security deposits required were beyond his reach, and his applications were consistently rejected. Within a month, he found himself sleeping in his car, then later, when the car was repossessed, on the streets. The homeless shelter system was overcrowded and often unsafe. Michael quickly learned that his military training, while valuable for survival, also made him a target for those who saw his discipline and organization as a threat. He preferred to stay outside, finding places to sleep that offered some protection from the elements while keeping him away from the dangers of group shelters. His daily routine had become a careful choreography of survival. He woke before dawn to avoid police sweeps of homeless encampments, folded his sleeping bag and stored it in a hidden location, then began the day's search for food, water, and perhaps a few dollars from passers-by. The public library became his sanctuary during the day, offering warmth, bathroom facilities, and internet access that allowed him to continue looking for work and managing his veterans' benefits online. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had served his country with honor and distinction, leading Marines in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable, only to find himself invisible and ignored on the streets of the nation he had sworn to protect. The disconnect between his service record and his current circumstances felt surreal, like living in two different realities simultaneously. Despite his situation, Michael maintained hope that things would improve. He continued to apply for jobs, though finding employers willing to hire someone without a permanent address proved challenging. He attended job fairs specifically for veterans, participated in interview preparation workshops at the VA, and networked with other veterans who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers. But the combination of his physical limitations, gaps in his employment history, and housing instability created barriers that seemed insurmountable. The kindness of strangers provided occasional bright spots in his difficult days. A coffee shop owner who sometimes gave him leftover food at closing time. A librarian who helped him access resources online. A social worker at the VA who genuinely seemed to care about his situation. These small acts of humanity reminded him that not everyone had forgotten about people like him. His military training had taught him to never give up, to adapt and overcome regardless of circumstances. These lessons served him well on the streets, helping him navigate the complex social dynamics of homeless communities and avoid the dangers that claimed many of his fellow veterans. He witnessed too many good men and women succumb to addiction, mental illness, or simply give up hope entirely. The stigma surrounding homelessness was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his situation to bear. People assumed things about him based on his appearance and circumstances that were far from the truth. They saw someone who had failed, someone who had made poor choices, someone to be feared or pitied. They didn't see the decorated Marine who had led men and women in combat, who had saved lives, who had served with distinction for nearly 3 decades. Michael's story was not unique among homeless veterans. Across the country, thousands of men and women who had served in the military found themselves without stable housing. The transition from military to civilian life, combined with physical and mental health challenges related to their service, created a perfect storm of vulnerability that often led to homelessness. Despite numerous programs designed to help veterans, many fell through the cracks of an overwhelmed system. The morning routine of seeking donations from passers-by had become a form of silent communication with his community. He could tell within seconds whether someone might acknowledge him or not. The business suit rushing to catch the bus, eyes fixed straight ahead, no chance. The young couple walking hand in hand, stealing glances but quickening their pace, unlikely. The elderly woman fumbling in her purse while maintaining eye contact, possible. Most days brought in just enough money for a meal or two, and he was always grateful for whatever kindness people showed. He never pressured anyone. Never followed people who walked past, never became aggressive or demanding. His military bearing and respectful demeanor set him apart from some of the more desperate individuals on the streets. Though most people didn't notice the difference, the weather was his constant adversary. Portland's frequent rain made finding dry places to sleep a nightly challenge. His tent was old and leaked. His sleeping bag was rated for temperatures warmer than the Pacific Northwest winters provided, and his clothes were insufficient for the damp cold that seemed to seep into his bones. The physical discomfort was matched by the emotional toll of being constantly exposed to the elements with no reliable shelter. Health care was a constant concern. While the VA provided medical care, getting to appointments without transportation was difficult, and his chronic back pain was exacerbated by sleeping on hard surfaces and carrying his belongings everywhere he went. Mental health services were available but required navigating a complex system of appointments and waiting lists that often seemed designed to discourage rather than help. As weeks turned to months and months turned to years, Michael watched the city change around him. New buildings went up, old ones came down, businesses opened and closed. The homeless population shifted and evolved, with familiar faces disappearing and new ones taking their place. Some found housing and moved on to better situations. Others simply moved to different areas or different cities, and too many died from exposure, overdose, or violence. The invisibility was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of homelessness. Being looked through rather than looked at, being treated as an obstacle rather than a person, being discussed in political terms rather than human ones, it all contributed to a sense of losing one's identity and worth. Michael fought against this erasure by maintaining his military standards of personal conduct and continuing to see himself as more than his circumstances. His tactical awareness, honed through years of military service, served him well in identifying safe places to sleep and dangerous situations to avoid. He could read the body language and intentions of others with an accuracy that kept him out of most trouble. The streets had their own rules and hierarchies, their own codes of conduct and survival strategies, and his military training helped him navigate this complex social environment. The tattoo on his arm remained one of the few visible connections to his former life and identity. When he caught glimpses of it while washing in public restrooms or changing clothes, it reminded him of who he had been and who he still was underneath his current circumstances. The eagle, globe, and anchor represented not just his military service, but the values and principles that still guided his daily actions: honor, courage, and commitment. Each day brought the same challenges and the same small hopes. Perhaps today would bring a job opportunity, a housing lead, or simply enough donations to afford a hot meal. Perhaps someone would see past his circumstances to the person beneath. Perhaps today would mark the beginning of his journey back to stability and dignity. The contrast between his military career and his current situation created a cognitive dissonance that was difficult to reconcile. How could someone go from leading Marines in combat operations to holding a cardboard sign on a street corner? The question haunted him daily, but it also motivated him to keep fighting for a better future. As the sun reached its peak and the lunch crowd began to emerge from office buildings, Michael adjusted his position on the sidewalk and straightened his sign. Another day of survival was underway, another opportunity to connect with the humanity that still existed in a world that often seemed to have forgotten about people like him. He remained hopeful that someone would see not just a homeless veteran, but a fellow human being worthy of dignity and respect. Corporal James Rodriguez stepped off the city bus and immediately felt the familiar weight of his dress blue uniform. At 24 years old, he carried himself with the confident bearing of a Marine who had found his purpose in service. The morning air in downtown Portland was crisp, and he was heading to a Veterans Day ceremony at the federal courthouse, where he would be presenting colors with other local Marines. As he walked through the busy downtown area, James couldn't help but notice how different civilian life seemed from his world. People rushed past each other without acknowledgement, focused on their personal missions with little awareness of their surroundings. It was so different from the brotherhood he knew in the Corps, where every Marine looked out for every other Marine, where no one was left behind or forgotten. His sharp eyes, trained to notice details and assess situations quickly, swept the sidewalk ahead. That's when he saw the man sitting against the brick wall of an old building, holding a cardboard sign. From a distance, James couldn't read the words, but something about the man's posture caught his attention. Even sitting on the ground, the homeless man maintained an upright bearing, shoulders squared, head held high despite his circumstances. As James drew closer, he could make out the words on the weathered sign: "Homeless veteran, anything helps." The sight hit him like a physical blow. Here was another veteran, someone who had served their country, reduced to asking for help on the street. James had heard about homeless veterans in his training sessions and community outreach programs, but seeing one in person brought the reality into sharp focus. When James was close enough to see the man clearly, his trained eye immediately recognized something that others might miss. The homeless veteran's clothes were worn and faded, but they were clean and arranged with military precision. His gray hair was neat despite his circumstances, and there was something in his eyes that spoke of experience and dignity that homelessness hadn't been able to erase. Then James saw it. A flash of familiar imagery on the man's right forearm as he adjusted his position. Even partially hidden beneath a worn jacket sleeve, James could make out part of an eagle, globe, and anchor tattoo. The distinctive emblem of the United States Marine Corps was as recognizable to James as his own reflection. His heart rate quickened as he processed what he was seeing. Without hesitation, James approached the homeless veteran. Years of military courtesy and respect for senior Marines had been drilled into him since boot camp. This man, regardless of his current circumstances, was a fellow Marine, and therefore deserving of respect and assistance. The young corporal came to attention a respectful distance away. "Good morning, sir," James said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of military training but softened with genuine respect. "I couldn't help but notice your tattoo. Are you a Marine?" Michael looked up, surprised by the formal greeting and the recognition in the young man's voice. He hadn't been addressed with such respect in years. The sight of James in his dress blue uniform brought back a flood of memories from his own days in dress blues, standing tall and proud, representing something greater than himself. "Yes, son, I am," Michael replied, his voice regaining some of its old authority. "Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson, retired, 28 years of service." As he spoke, he unconsciously straightened his posture even more, the muscle memory of military bearing asserting itself. James immediately came to the position of attention and rendered a sharp salute. "Corporal James Rodriguez, sir. It's an honor to meet you." The formal military courtesies seemed perfectly natural to both men, creating an instant connection that transcended their different circumstances. Michael was taken aback by the respect shown by this young Marine. For years, he had been invisible to most people, treated as a problem to be avoided rather than a person to be acknowledged. To be saluted again, to be called sir again, to have his service recognized, it was overwhelming in the best possible way. "Where did you serve, Staff Sergeant?" James asked, settling into a more relaxed posture but maintaining his respectful demeanor. "Iraq twice, Afghanistan once," Michael replied, his voice gaining strength. "Camp Lejeune, Camp Pendleton, 29 Palms. Started as infantry, moved into logistics coordination. Led some good Marines in some tough places." James nodded with understanding. Though he hadn't yet deployed overseas, he knew the weight those place names carried. These weren't just geographic locations. They were proving grounds where Marines had tested themselves and each other, where brotherhood was forged in the crucible of shared hardship and danger. "What unit?" James continued, genuinely interested in learning about this veteran's service. "2nd Battalion, 8th Marines for most of my career," Michael answered, a note of pride creeping into his voice. "The Americas Battalion. We did good work over there. Took care of each other. Brought most everyone home." The conversation continued as other pedestrians flowed around them, most still oblivious to the significance of the meeting taking place on the sidewalk. James found himself drawn into Michael's stories of military life, recognizing the same values and experiences that had shaped his own service. Despite their age difference and different circumstances, they spoke the same language, the language of Marines. James learned that Michael had been living on the streets for 3 years, struggling with a combination of physical injuries from his service, difficulty transitioning to civilian employment, and a series of unfortunate circumstances that had led to his homelessness. The young Marine was astounded that a decorated veteran with nearly 3 decades of service could find himself in such a situation. "Staff Sergeant, this isn't right," James said, his voice filled with emotion. "You shouldn't be out here like this. You served our country with honor. We need to get you some help." Michael appreciated the sentiment but had heard similar words before from well-meaning people. "I've been working with the VA, son. These things take time. The system is overwhelmed, and there are a lot of us who need help." But James wasn't the type to accept that answer. His Marine training had taught him that when you see a problem, you find a solution. When a fellow Marine is in trouble, you don't walk away. You figure out how to help. The concept of leaving another Marine behind was completely foreign to everything he had been taught. "Sir, I'm not just walking away from this," James said with determination. "We're Marines. We don't leave our own behind, and we don't accept that's just the way it is when it comes to taking care of our brothers." The young corporal pulled out his phone and began making calls. First, he contacted his unit's family readiness group coordinator, explaining the situation and asking for immediate resources and contacts. Then he called a Marine veteran he knew who worked with homeless services in the city. Each conversation was brief and focused, with James gathering information and building a network of support. Michael watched in amazement as this young Marine mobilized resources on his behalf. It had been years since anyone had advocated for him with such determination and urgency. The feeling of being truly seen and valued as a person, not just as a problem, was almost overwhelming. Within an hour, James had compiled a list of immediate resources: a veterans housing program with current openings, a job placement service specifically for veterans, and a medical clinic that specialized in treating service-connected injuries. But more importantly, he had made it clear that Michael wasn't going to navigate these resources alone. "Staff Sergeant, here's what we're going to do," James said with the confident authority of a Marine who had identified his mission. "I'm going to help you get connected with these services, and I'm going to make sure you have someone in your corner who understands what you've been through." The Veterans Day ceremony James had been heading to suddenly seemed less important than the veteran sitting in front of him who needed immediate assistance. This was what service really meant, not just the ceremonies and parades, but the daily commitment to taking care of fellow veterans and ensuring that their sacrifices were honored through action, not just words. James sat down next to Michael on the sidewalk, unmindful of his dress blue uniform that represented hours of careful preparation. "Tell me more about your situation, sir. What are the biggest challenges you're facing right now? What kind of work are you looking for? What do you need most immediately?" The questions were practical and focused, revealing James's analytical approach to problem-solving. He wasn't offering empty sympathy or vague promises of help. He was gathering intelligence to develop an effective plan of action. Michael found himself opening up to this young Marine in ways he hadn't been able to with social workers, counselors, or volunteers. As they talked, other people began to take notice of the unusual sight. A Marine in dress blues sitting on the sidewalk, deep in conversation with a homeless veteran. Some passers-by looked confused, others curious, but James paid them no attention. His focus was entirely on his fellow Marine and the mission of getting him the help he deserved. Michael shared details about his struggles with the VA bureaucracy, the challenges of finding employment without a permanent address, the physical limitations caused by his service-connected injuries, and the isolation he felt as a veteran trying to navigate civilian systems. James listened intently, asking clarifying questions and taking notes on his phone. "Staff Sergeant, I want you to know that your service matters," James said earnestly. "What you did over there, the Marines you led, the missions you completed, that has value and it always will. Your current situation doesn't change that, and it doesn't define who you are." The words hit Michael harder than he expected. For years, he had felt like his military service was ancient history, irrelevant to his current circumstances. Society seemed to have moved on, and he often felt forgotten and discarded. Hearing a fellow Marine acknowledge the value and importance of his service reminded him of who he was beneath the layers of hardship and disappointment. James's phone rang. It was his unit commander, wondering why he hadn't arrived at the Veterans Day ceremony yet. "Sir, I'm currently assisting a homeless veteran who needs immediate attention," James reported. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, 28 years of service, Iraq and Afghanistan veteran. I need to see this through." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then, "Roger that, Corporal. Take care of your Marine. The ceremony can wait." The response perfectly encapsulated the values that James had learned in the Corps: mission first, but never at the expense of fellow Marines. Taking care of each other wasn't just a slogan. It was a fundamental principle that guided every decision and action. As the morning progressed, James made more calls and sent texts to his network of Marine contacts. Word spread quickly through the local veteran community that a homeless Marine needed assistance. Offers of help began flowing in: temporary housing, job leads, transportation, clothing, and most importantly, ongoing support and friendship. Michael was amazed by the response. In a few hours, this young Marine had mobilized more resources and support than he had been able to access in months of working through official channels. The power of the Marine network, the commitment to taking care of each other, was something he had almost forgotten existed. "This is what we do, Staff Sergeant," James explained. "We're Marines. When one of us is in trouble, we all respond. It doesn't matter if we served in different decades or never served together. We're all part of the same brotherhood." As the afternoon approached, James had arranged for Michael to meet with a veteran services coordinator that evening, secured temporary housing for the next several nights, and connected him with 3 different job placement services. But perhaps most importantly, he had restored Michael's sense of dignity and belonging. "I need to ask you something, Staff Sergeant," James said as they prepared to head to their first appointment. "Would you be willing to speak to my unit about your experiences? Not just the hard parts, but your whole story, your service, your leadership, the challenges you've faced. I think my Marines could learn a lot from you." The request surprised Michael. To be asked to share his knowledge and experience with active-duty Marines, to be valued for his wisdom and insights rather than pitied for his circumstances, felt like a return to his true identity as a Marine leader. "I'd be honored to, Corporal," Michael replied, standing up and brushing off his clothes with military precision. "Semper Fi. Semper Fi, Staff Sergeant." James responded, offering his arm for support as they began walking toward their first destination. As they moved down the sidewalk together, a young Marine in dress blues and an older Marine in worn civilian clothes, they drew attention for all the right reasons. They represented the eternal bond that connects all Marines across generations and circumstances, the commitment to never leaving a fellow Marine behind, and the power of recognition and respect to restore dignity and hope. The morning that had started with Michael sitting invisibly on a sidewalk was ending with him walking proudly alongside a fellow Marine toward a new beginning. The tattoo on his arm, which had gone unnoticed by thousands of passers-by, had been recognized by the one person who understood its true meaning and significance. The temporary housing James had arranged for Michael was a small room in a veteran-specific transitional facility across town. As they walked through the front doors together that evening, Michael felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. He had been disappointed by promises before, and part of him was afraid to believe that this time might be different. The facility coordinator, a retired Navy veteran named Susan Martinez, greeted them with genuine warmth and professionalism. She had received James's phone call earlier and had been working throughout the afternoon to expedite Michael's intake process, cutting through red tape that typically took weeks to navigate. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," she said, extending her hand in greeting. "Welcome home. We're going to take good care of you here." The words, "welcome home," resonated deeply with Michael. It had been years since anyone had used those words to address him, and they carried special meaning in the veteran community. This wasn't just temporary housing, it was a place where his service was understood and respected. James stayed for the entire intake process, ensuring that Michael was comfortable with the arrangements and that all his immediate needs were addressed. The room was small but clean, with a proper bed, a desk, and most importantly, a door that locked from the inside. After years of sleeping in exposed places, the privacy and security felt luxurious. "I'll be back tomorrow morning, Staff Sergeant," James promised as they said their goodbyes. "We have an appointment with the job placement specialist at 0900, and then we're meeting with the VA housing coordinator at 1400. I'll pick you up at 0830. Michael was struck by the young Marine's military precision in scheduling and his unwavering commitment to following through on his promises. In his experience with various service providers over the past 3 years, appointments were often rescheduled, coordinators were frequently unavailable, and promises of help rarely materialized into concrete action. That night, Michael slept better than he had in months. The safety and comfort of having 4 walls and a roof allowed his body to truly rest for the first time in years. But more than the physical comfort, it was the restoration of hope that made the difference. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that things might actually get better. True to his word, James arrived at 0830 sharp the next morning. He had traded his dress blues for civilian clothes, but his military bearing remained unmistakable. They shared coffee and breakfast at a nearby diner, where James outlined the day's schedule and the longer-term plan he had been developing. "I've been thinking about this all night, Staff Sergeant," James said over his coffee. "The job placement is important, but I think there's something else you could do that would be even more valuable. There are a lot of veterans struggling out there, and you have experience and perspective that could help them." James had contacted a local nonprofit organization that provided services to homeless veterans. They were always looking for peer counselors, people who had lived through similar experiences and could provide guidance and support to others in crisis. The position came with training, a modest salary, and most importantly, the opportunity to use Michael's military leadership skills in a civilian context. The job interview that morning went better than Michael had dared to hope. The program director, herself a veteran, immediately recognized the value that his combination of military leadership experience and personal understanding of homelessness could bring to their clients. His ability to connect with veterans in crisis, to speak their language and understand their struggles, was exactly what their program needed. "We're not just offering you a job, Staff Sergeant," the director explained. "We're offering you a mission. These veterans need someone who's been where they are, someone who can show them that recovery is possible." The concept of having a mission again was powerfully appealing to Michael. Military service had given his life purpose and meaning, and the years of homelessness had left him feeling adrift and directionless. The opportunity to serve other veterans, to use his hardest experiences to help others avoid or overcome similar challenges, felt like a return to his true calling. The VA housing appointment that afternoon resulted in placement on a priority list for permanent supportive housing. Michael's service record, combined with his current housing instability and medical documentation of his service-connected disabilities, qualified him for expedited placement. The coordinator estimated that permanent housing would be available within 4 to 6 weeks. Over the following days, James maintained regular contact with Michael, checking on his progress and providing transportation to various appointments. But their relationship had evolved beyond simply helping a homeless veteran find services. James had come to respect Michael's knowledge and experience, often seeking his advice on military matters and leadership challenges he faced with his own Marines. The peer counselor training program began the following week. Michael threw himself into the coursework with the same dedication he had once applied to military training. He learned about trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing, and crisis intervention techniques. But more importantly, he began to process his own experiences through the lens of helping others. His first client was a young Army veteran named David, who had been living in his car for 2 months. David's story was depressingly familiar. Difficulty finding employment, struggles with PTSD, a series of personal crises that had led to homelessness. But unlike the social workers and counselors David had worked with before, Michael could speak to him as someone who had walked the same path. "I know what it's like," Michael told David during their first session. "I know how it feels to be invisible, to have people look through you like you don't exist. I know the shame and the anger and the feeling like you failed everyone who believed in you. But I also know that this isn't the end of your story." Michael's credibility with homeless veterans was immediate and powerful. They could sense that he truly understood their experiences, that he wasn't speaking from textbook knowledge, but from lived reality. His calm authority and genuine empathy created an environment where veterans felt safe to share their struggles and fears. Within his first month as a peer counselor, Michael had helped 3 veterans secure housing and 2 others enroll in job training programs. But his impact went beyond the measurable outcomes. Veterans who had been resistant to accepting help from traditional service providers began engaging with the program because of Michael's involvement. James continued to be a regular presence in Michael's life, visiting him at work and including him in social activities with other Marines. The young corporal had introduced Michael to his entire unit, and several Marines had reached out to offer friendship and support. The isolation that had characterized Michael's homeless years was replaced by a renewed sense of community and belonging. The Marine unit James belonged to decided to adopt Michael's story as part of their ongoing community outreach efforts. They organized fundraising events for homeless veterans, volunteer days at the transitional housing facility, and educational sessions about veteran homelessness. Michael became a frequent speaker at these events, sharing his story and educating active-duty Marines about the challenges some veterans face after leaving military service. "Your story matters, Staff Sergeant," James told him after a particularly moving presentation to a group of young Marines. "When you tell them about your service and your struggles, you're not just sharing information. You're showing them what it means to persevere, to maintain your dignity and values even in the worst circumstances." Michael's permanent housing came through faster than expected, a 1-bedroom apartment in a veteran-focused housing complex. James helped him move his few belongings from the transitional facility to his new home, and other Marines contributed furniture, kitchen supplies, and household necessities. The apartment wasn't large, but it represented something Michael had thought he might never have again, a place that was truly his own. The transformation in Michael's life was remarkable, but it wasn't just about the housing and employment. The recognition and respect he had received from James and the broader Marine community had restored his sense of identity and self-worth. He no longer saw himself as a homeless person who happened to be a veteran. He was a Marine who had experienced homelessness and overcome it. His work as a peer counselor continued to expand. The nonprofit organization promoted him to a senior position, supervising other peer counselors and developing new programs specifically for veteran clients. His unique combination of military leadership experience and personal understanding of homelessness made him exceptionally effective in this role. Michael began speaking at conferences and training events across the region, sharing his insights about veteran homelessness and the importance of peer support in recovery. His presentations were powerful and moving, helping to change perceptions about homeless veterans and advocating for more effective services and support systems. The relationship between Michael and James had evolved into a true friendship that transcended their different ranks and circumstances. They met regularly for coffee or meals, discussing everything from military history to current events. James often sought Michael's advice on leadership challenges, while Michael appreciated having someone who understood and respected his military experience. "You saved my life, you know," Michael told James one afternoon as they sat in his new apartment. "Not just by getting me off the streets, but by seeing me as more than my circumstances. You reminded me who I really am." James smiled and shook his head. "Staff Sergeant, you saved yourself. I just did what any Marine would do. I recognized a fellow Marine who needed assistance. Everything you've accomplished since then, all the lives you've helped, all the barriers you've overcome, that's all you." The ripple effects of their chance encounter continued to spread throughout the veteran community. Other Marines in James's unit became involved in veteran outreach efforts. The transitional housing facility where Michael had stayed began partnering with active duty units to provide mentorship and support for homeless veterans. The peer counseling program that Michael helped develop became a model for other organizations across the country. Michael's story began appearing in local news outlets and veteran publications, highlighting both the problem of veteran homelessness and the power of veteran-to-veteran support in addressing it. He was invited to testify before legislative committees about the need for better services and more effective policies to prevent and end veteran homelessness. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came when Michael was invited to speak at his old Marine unit's annual birthday celebration. Standing before a crowd of Marines in dress blues wearing a suit James had helped him select, Michael felt the full weight of his journey from homeless veteran to respected advocate and leader. "Marines," he began, his voice carrying the authority and confidence that had never truly left him. "I stand before you tonight as proof that no matter how far we fall, no matter what challenges we face, we are never truly defeated as long as we remember who we are and what we stand for." The applause that followed was more than polite appreciation. It was recognition from his fellow Marines that he had not only survived his ordeal, but had emerged stronger and more committed to the values they all shared. He had transformed his darkest period into a source of strength and service to others. In the months that followed, Michael continued his work as a peer counselor and advocate. But he also took on a new role as a mentor to young Marines transitioning out of military service. His experience with the challenges of civilian transition, combined with his knowledge of available resources and support systems, made him uniquely qualified to help other Marines avoid the pitfalls he had encountered. The tattoo on his right forearm, which had gone unnoticed by thousands of passers-by during his years on the street, had become a symbol of resilience and brotherhood. When veterans in crisis saw it during counseling sessions, it reminded them that they were not alone, that someone who had walked their path was there to help them find their way forward. James was promoted to sergeant and remained committed to veteran outreach efforts throughout his continued military service. He often brought new Marines to meet Michael, using his story to illustrate the importance of taking care of fellow veterans and the difference that individual action could make in another person's life. The chance encounter between a young Marine and a homeless veteran had grown into something much larger, a network of support and advocacy that touched hundreds of lives. Michael's transformation from invisible street dweller to respected leader and advocate demonstrated the power of recognition, respect, and brotherhood to restore hope and dignity to those who serve. Years later, Michael would often reflect on that November morning when James approached him on the sidewalk. A single act of recognition, seeing beyond circumstances, to acknowledge the person and the service, had changed not just his life, but the lives of countless other veterans he had been able to help along their own journeys toward stability and hope. The brotherhood that had sustained him through combat operations halfway around the world had ultimately rescued him from the battleground of civilian streets. In recognizing his tattoo and honoring his service, James had reminded Michael that once a Marine, always a Marine, and Marines never leave their own behind.